I mean, it's already there. Nicola Sturgeon has played her cards pretty well. Ian Blackford has been an outstanding MP, as has Joanna Cherry and these other people in the SNP. They were the real luminaries of the last Parliament. And they will get their independent Scotland. They will get a second referendum, in my opinion, within a year from now. So by the time we come to Valentine's Day 2021, I think we're going to have an independent Scotland and a reunited Ireland within the EU. So that's just my prediction. Some people, of course, don't want this. They don't like Sinn Fein. They say, oh, but they're socialists. You know, I know people in Ireland that are anti-socialist and really, you know, with horror look at this development today. There is obviously a conservative tradition in Ireland, and you know, Edmund Burke was a conservative and from Ireland. And there was some, you know, I mean, Ireland, like every culture, has got people on all sides of the political spectrum. What I would say is that the anti-socialist tradition often usually doesn't understand what socialism is. It's got a bogey word in its mind, and it thinks, oh, socialists, they're terrible, you know. And I think the Trump-ites and Steve Bannon, the Republicans, they all are psyched up to hate the left. The same with Netanyahu and his Likud party. And the same with the Saudi regime, which is a sort of theocratic worldview that sees everything left of Genghis Khan as somehow, you know, existentially evil. And it's a trait of extreme right-wing Islamic terrorist groups that are also very anti-socialist and anti-communist. Well, okay, so they and some of them allied with extreme right-wing forces like fascist movements in the 1930s. So as a political scientist, all I can say is that we need to do some rethinking about this. That's why I'm doing a commentary on Karl Marx's Das Kapital at the moment. And I come from a tradition of you know, a communist background, my family. And although I didn't follow that, I still intellectually understand it. So I'm a mediator, if you want, between the socialists and the non-socialist world. And I'm saying let's understand this, let's sublimate our understanding in an intellectually robust way. Now, what a lot of people don't realise, and I've been digging away at this for years, I published a book some years ago here, towards a history of the interrelations of Marxism and esotericism, which was, I wrote it when I was an undergraduate studying at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at the University of London. And that was my college, School of Slavonic and East European Studies. It's now a part of University College. It was actually set up at King's College initially, and it had become an independent institute when I was studying there. And I went into the history of Marxism and communism in enormous detail for this work, going right back through the 20th century to the 19th century. And I discovered something very interesting, that a lot of these Marxists were actually, people on the left, were actually very influenced by esoteric and we could call them occult movements, or we could call them Freemasonic groups. You know, Marx was moving in a very interesting circle, as was Engels. This is a biography of Engels, which I've inherited from my mother, written by a journalist, John Green. And these people were actually, deep down, romantic socialists. Marx began his career as a poet. He was a lover of wine, women and song. He used to traipse around Trier, writing poetry for his girlfriend, Jenny von Westphalen. Socialism is a romantic dream. It's like the flourishing of the romantic movement into politics. And Shelley, to an extent Byron, with his independence struggles in Greece, these were the great romantic progenitors of socialism. Victor Hugo in France was a romantic socialist. And I've discovered, I've been working recently on a great early socialist called Louis Blanc, who was French. And by living in France, I'm you know, able to sit at the feet of these people's memories without, you know, oh God, socialists hate them, kind of pouring over my shoulder. as it would be in, say, Trumpville. No, Louis Blanc was born in Madrid. His father, Jean-Charles Louis Blanc, was in Bonaparte's administration running Spain at the time. Now, whatever you want to say about Bonaparte and his takeover of Spain, when the Bonaparte army turned up in Madrid, the Inquisition was full of prisoners still. The Spanish Inquisition was still running in Spain, right? And they still had people being tortured in the prisons of Madrid. Napoleon's army set them free. They brought liberty, equality and fraternity. They brought republicanism to Spain, and they brought this idea of actually human rights, citizens' rights, and it was quite popular. And Louis Blanc's father was Jean Blanc, was actually a minister of finance in this. And then he was brought up. Sadly, a tragedy happened because his mother died. The father went mad. I mean, he must have loved the mother so much, he started talking to her or whatever, went mad, and the poor boy had to leave college and look after the rest of the family. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he came to Paris. They were French, but they'd been in Madrid, being part of the government. Now they came to Paris. And he grew up in Paris. It was difficult. He was like the head of the family, pretty, down at heels type of existence. And he studied economics. He gradually developed his cachet, so to say, in Paris and became a significant figure as a thinker. And he proposed what should be done with society. How can we solve the problems of rich and poor? What is the way, the instrument? He said, look, what we need is the state should not take over and control everything. It should enable the working classes to become self-sufficient. And he thought of this idea of let's have workshops in every town where instead of being unemployed, you would go and learn a trade, you'd be given equipment, materials, tools to advance in some skilled trade, and the state would fund all that, make it possible. So there'd be no need for unemployment and poverty. Everyone would have dignity, pride in whatever. So state-run workshops for full employment was his project. And in the 1848 revolution, he was actually given a job as minister. He became a member of the government. And for a brief period, he was given the ability to set these workshops up. Unfortunately, he was kiboshed by a rival who deliberately blocked it all. The type of bureaucrat that smiles but then does the opposite. So Louis Blanc's ideas failed because it was deliberate. Someone on the more conservative wing, jealous of his ideas, whatever, and it never happened. Then the government fell and there was a right-wing counter-reaction, and Louis Blanc had to flee for his life. He escaped to Belgium, and then he came to London. And what's extraordinary, and by the way, why is Louis Blanc important? Okay, so he coins the word capitalist and capitalism. In his studies, he looks back in exile in London. He writes up a history of the French Revolution in many volumes, 12 volumes between 1847 and 1862, using the British Museum. Now, this is exactly the time when Marx is in London, also in the British Museum, writing Das Kapital. And yet Louis Blanc, who's working on the other table, actually coined the word. Now, Marx never acknowledges Blanc's input. It's one of the things that annoys me about Marx, is he's a real plagiarist. He pinches ideas right, left and centre, and he never acknowledges their source. Blanc was a romantic socialist. He believed also in Freemasonry. He became a member of the lodges in France. He was a member of the Masonic Order of Memphis. He joined the Grand Lodge of the Philadelphians in London. And he believed that you can't get socialism unless you have an ethical transformation of human beings. Freemasonry is one of the ways you can do that. He also was faithful to the church. He said Christianity's fine. It just needs to be implemented. Like Saint-Simon, he called for an authentic Christianity. And he became friends in London with John Stuart Mill, the great liberal philosopher. So he was moving in different circles, and I haven't yet discovered, I don't think Marx would have wanted to meet him, because Marx was so convinced he was right, he was the prophet of socialism and Marxism as it became called, that he wasn't prepared to concede anyone had any other ideas of value. Now that's a sign of arrogance. No, I'm not a Marxist, I don't accept that. I'm a romantic socialist in the Louis Blanc tradition. What Blanc did was he analysed capitalism, and he said in his definition, what I call capitalism, that is to say the appropriation of capital by some to the exclusion of others. That's from his book Organisation du Travail in 1851. So anyway, look at Louis Blanc. And the socialist tradition that I believe Sinn Fein stands for and that the Labour Party stands for is a moderate socialism, which isn't about a tyranny of the working classes. It's about maturing human beings to a level of intelligence that where we want to share naturally, because our educational, our spiritual awakening is so advanced that this idea of selfishly exploiting poor people would just not arise, because in an enlightened mind it doesn't arise. Because enlightenment brings an automatic sense of justice and truth and love. So I think that's the real character of Ireland. I think it's also the real character of Britain. I think that these conservative types, these ruthless, horrendous people that have seized control of the Conservative Party, and they use this fake rhetoric of anti-socialism. Are they anti-society? Are they anti-people? I mean, they are literally ill-educated and ill-mannered in their, and as far as intellectually, let's just say they're intellectually challenged, in my view, because they've not actually read these things. They don't understand what they're talking about. Go off and read my work on the Freemasonic origins of communism and give it some thought. Okay, now I want to talk about another romantic socialist who lived locally, called Pierre Leroux. He was the mayor of my local village, or town, called Boussac, here in La Creuse. And Philippe Leroux was another, so Pierre Leroux, L-E-R-O-U-X. He was a colleague, very similar to Louis Blanc, slightly, he became the mayor of my town, Boussac, in that 1848 revolutionary time, when genuine democracy came to France. In Ireland, it was the time of the Great Famine. Hundreds of thousands of people were starving to death, and the British capitalist system said we can't interfere because we have to do laissez-faire. Let them starve, because otherwise, it'll go against our laissez-faire economic ideology. Unbelievably, a boat came from the Ottoman Empire with supplies for the Irish. I mean, and this is why Sinn Fein have won today, or done so well, because the absurdities of how London has tried or misgoverned Ireland for so long is such that it has no right to do it anymore. That's why Sinn Fein refused to sit in the Westminster Parliament. They regard it as, the beast of Behemoth, and it's not worth going to. I've come round to their view, I'm afraid, having watched the 3 years of Brexit catastrophe. I used to be a believer in the integrity of the Westminster system. I think I'm not anymore, because I realise how duplicitous and capitalist-driven it is. It's easy to do a coup there. That's what the Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail, the capitalist barons that run the Tory party have done. They've hijacked it, taken it over on a kind of anti-socialist, hysterical, gotta stop Corbyn hysteria. Plus, and they used the Brexit thing as a kind of incredibly useful stick to beat the left with. Shocking. Anyway, it's going to work out in the end all right, I think, because we're going to get Irish unification and we're going to get Scottish independence, and we will eventually get a proper humane remainder of Britain out of this. So yes, Pierre Leroux, thank you. His work, he was also a Freemason, by the way, and an intellectual who wrote, he was a great friend of George Sand, the French novelist who lived locally to me. She was the kind of, I don't know, George Eliot of France in the Victorian era, and she lived up the road from me. If you come and visit, you can go to the museum in her honour. She was the lover and friend of Chopin, the great pianist, the classic romantic pianist, right? He was composing his work up the road with George Sand and Pierre Leroux. They were part of, you know, a circle of romantic visionaries. Leroux was trying to say, in society, let's make it as beautiful as a Chopin mazurka. How can we reform society so it doesn't have cruelty in it, so it doesn't have violence, so it doesn't have exploitation, so it doesn't have poverty? I mean, there's nothing wrong with poverty if that's what you want and you've opted out, you're like a Jain monk and you eat half a bowl of rice a day and water and you fast and meditate all the time. That's fine, go for it. There's a place for that. Voluntary poverty is fine. But if you're a family living in Brixton and you're struggling to make ends meet and the creditors are ringing you up all the time and your wife's depressed because, you know, she can't afford anything and your children are like, you know, they've bitten their fingernails to the quick because they can't afford to go to school and have lunch, etc., etc. I mean, I think, was it 14 million people in the UK are now living in poverty? There was a figure that came out last week. Well, that's involuntary poverty. That's not the same as renouncing the world and accepting it. That's involuntary poverty, and that's totally unacceptable. And that's why this romantic socialist is so important. And thank you, Sinn Fein voters in Ireland, for flagging this up on behalf of the rest of the country, the whole of the British Isles. Okay, I want to now talk about something slightly different. And I'm going to have to stand up, I think, to do this, because this is a more metaphysical part of my talk, the philosophical bit. I hope this is going to work here. I think it should. Right. So, I've been musing a lot in this last week, and obviously with all these world events going on, about what is the kind of metaphysical basis for peace work. How can we reconcile the many different forms of internationalism that are each proclaiming a way forward? I've also just written a correspondence forward for a professor of philosophy in Moscow called Alexander Chumakov, who's an old friend of mine, who's on the board of the World Intellectual Forum. And he's just written a book of essays about globalization and international affairs and how we can solve international relations in a more peaceful light. And I was thinking about this whilst I was writing my little foreword to his book, and about different forms of internationalism, how we can reconcile them. Now, one of the ways we can do that is by trying to integrate them into an overall synthesis. So we have different people proposing world federalism. We have communism still proposing itself as the solution, mostly in China. We have capitalist internationalism with the USA. We have a more sort of democratic socialist internationalism, which is more like the European Union model. Then we have religious internationalisms. We have Islam, the kind of monotheistic internationalism, and also Judaism as a very similar to that, with Zionism, the idea that, you know, the one state of Israel, the great God's chosen state, etc. And then we have a Trinitarian internationalism associated with Christianity. And it's that one I want to address. I just want to talk about, because my job is not to say any of these is better than the others. It's to provide a framework whereby they can all integrate and interrelate to each other in a peaceful modality. And that means how to integrate these different types of internationalism. And there are others, by the way. There's the scientific internationalism that says science is the only way to unite the planet because of things like global warming, and, you know, science is needed. That's the kind of another way. And you know, my daughters in Brighton are in a big green event today, campaigning against the destruction of the trees of Brighton and Stanmer and so on. So the Green International is another form. They're all part of the solution, but as long as they're all working separately, we're not going to get the solution, I think. Now, I want to, maybe in future talks I'll talk about other forms of internationalism, but this one I want to talk about is the Trinitarian kind, because it's often overlooked. A lot of people think the Church and Christ and the teachings of the Church, the Trinity, are just passé, ridiculous, ignore them. There's nothing to it. But I want to address that. You see, the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, is very important in Christianity. And we all know what it looks like. So we have God the Father, and God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And if you go to a conventional Anglican or Catholic or Orthodox church, these are the big three, right? God, the absolute, the unknowable, takes this form. Now, the details of that were worked out in the first decades, the first centuries of early Christianity, and then it was finally formulated by Hilary of Poitiers later on, who was actually a local saint to me. Poitiers is just up the road. I've always argued, since I've researched this in great detail, that the Trinitarian idea of Christianity had various inspirational sources, some of them Greek, but also some of them Celtic. And I want to just mention that the Druid community of Gaul and Ireland and all over the Celtic world, you know, Wales, Scotland, etc., work with the trinity of the three rays of the Arwen. They meet at the central place of light, where we can't, you know, where we download wisdom and enlightenment. And the Druids always thought in threes. So the earliest poetry of Britain is called the Triads. The Triads are three-formed in structure. We also know from art that the Celts had these very, very complicated triskelions, threefold, you know, whirling shapes that exist in their metalwork and also in pottery and so on. And these have been found from very early on. Look at, say, the shield from Battersea that was thrown into the Thames as an offering. The Celts loved putting things into rivers and lakes because it was a way of returning things to the goddess. And that's why King Arthur's sword was put into the lake at the end of his life. And they found in Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland this huge offering of weapons called, at a place called La Tène, which is on Lake Neuchâtel. And why did they put them there? You know, thousands of swords, spears, all kinds of things. Well, it's an offering which the Druids would have supervised, whereby the warriors said, okay, we've done our bit, we're giving this back to the mother, the goddess, because they don't need the weapons anymore. I mean, I have the Peace Sword of Britain for the Druid community, as some of you know. And it's a great honour to carry that. And also, these Druids would have had that in the ancient times. The swords sometimes were ceremonial. The Unetice culture, which is prior to the Latin and Hallstatt culture, is also the source of the Celts. And they had symbolic daggers, symbolic weapons as well. They also had a writing, by the way, which is very interesting. Unetice is named after a little village in the Czech Republic, not far from Prague. And that culture is ancestral to the Celts in Europe. And they also had a writing system, which is very similar to descendants from the Paleolithic scripts that were found on caves by a Canadian researcher from like 30,000 BC. Okay, this is like seriously interesting stuff. I want to say I'm just publishing this week the first ever encyclopedia of Druid studies. And I've spent the last 3 years researching, writing, specifically writing it up. I've spent the last 40 years researching it. And it's 1,300 pages long. It's a huge thing, and so there's a lot of stuff in there about the Celts. And I think it's very interesting that this day I finished it is also this day in Irish history, when essentially reunification is now flagged up. As the peace druid of Europe, I have to say, you know, well done, chaps. Another figure who liked threes was Hegel. And if you haven't studied Hegel ever, please do so. You know, I'd say he's probably one of the greatest philosophers of European history, certainly in the last few centuries. His classic work is this, The Phenomenology of Spirit, which you may or may not have read. He was a very great master of universal esotericism. He'd studied Burma, he'd studied Qabalah, he'd studied Buddhism, he'd studied all the esoteric things he could get his hands on. And he wanted to try and explain in a way that normal people, you know, who haven't got years to spend studying absolute everything in esoteric detail, could grasp. And so he wanted to translate the collective wisdom of humanity into a kind of common sense language. And this was what he called the dialectics of logic, ultimately. He said we need a new logic, folks, because what we've got at the moment is everything's either or. You know, it's A versus B. So it's socialists versus anti-socialists, or it's Muslims versus anti-Muslims, you know, or it's Christians versus anti-Christians, etc., etc. So it's a logical conflict. Well, Hegel came along and said, I mean, it's very simple what he did. He applied the Trinitarian rule. He was also a Christian, by the way. And he said, okay, let's rethink this in you know, more intelligent terms. So we have an initial proposition, a thesis. Muhammad's the last prophet. Yeah, Islam's the only religion worth following. Thesis. And then we have a antithesis, which is like, no, he's not. There have been other prophets since him. There's been Guru Nanak, there's been the Baha'is, there's been all the New Age people, there's all the Druids. They've carried on doing prophetic, you know, oracular work. I mean, come on, he's not the last prophet. So then you have that. So then Hegel says, okay, we've got to make peace here, so let's have a synthesis. Let's have the S point where we can have the best bits of both. So what Muslims actually mean when they say Muhammad is the last prophet is they love him very much. It's like when Christians say Christ is the Son of God, what they mean is they love Christ very much. He's brilliant, they love him. So when you say he's the last prophet, what you mean is he's the only one for me. He's my last prophet. I'm fine with that. I'll stop there. I don't need to know about all the others. And that's true in a sense, right? And then the anti-position is, well, no, but there have been lots of other prophets. Okay, so the synthesis is, let's look at what they said, let's look at Guru Nanak and all the rest, that was complementary to what Muhammad had said. Is there anything that they said that couldn't be found also in the Quran? Well, no, actually. And that's why I'm doing a commentary on the Quran at the moment, because what you find in it is the incredible wisdom in the Quran is then replicated and brought out by later thinkers like Guru Nanak, like the Baha'is, and even like Carlyle and Emerson and 19th century idealists, and even Hegel, you know. It's reconcilable what Hegel is saying with aspects of Islamic advanced philosophical thought that have been going on for centuries. So this was Hegel's contribution. Now notice, of course, it's a 1, 2, 3, right? It's a Trinitarian approach, and that it's interesting that Hegel came from a part of Germany in the Rhineland, Stuttgart, that was originally a Druid area. And they found chariots, they found all kinds of Celtic burials in the area around Stuttgart where Hegel came from. I just throw that out there. Another thinker that thought in threes later was Rudolf Steiner. Some people might have heard of him, I hope. I used to be the librarian at Steiner House in the Anthroposophical Society headquarters in London back in the 80s. and I have a lot of time for aspects of Steiner. He got other things wrong, but he did a PhD and he did it on the philosophy of freedom, and he inspired educators and scientists and researchers in all branches of knowledge, still to this day. Well, his idea of what's called threefolding was very Trinitarian, and he said that society should be divided into different spheres. You should have the cultural and religious sphere. That should be under the domain of, like, the intellectuals, effectively. That's the intellectual sphere, okay? The kind of wife area. Then you've got the political sphere, which should be like government, politicians. I'm sure he would love my idea if they've got to speak the truth. I mean, Steiner would absolutely be jumping up and down for joy in heaven if he can hear that one. So the political sphere, he was very upset at the rise of Nazism, the stupidity of anti-Semitism. He had many great Jewish friends, and he'd studied the Qabalah and things. And they hated him. They said Steiner was, they did all the anti-Semitic stuff against Steiner. He was an anthroposophical founder, by the way. He used the phrase of Thomas Vaughan, who was the founder of anthroposophy, who was a Welsh mystic and an alchemist and a friend of Sir Robert Murray, who founded the Royal Society in London. Sir Robert Murray was a Scottish Freemason and a mystic and a scientist and a friend of Charles II, who then Thomas Vaughan worked with Sir Robert Murray and founded the Royal Society. He also coined this phrase anthroposophy, which Steiner looked at. And he said we need this wisdom, this human wisdom, to come down. So, and the third sphere is the economic. So that's the, the businessmen, kind of the people that know how money works. I mean, I'm useless with money, I haven't got a clue. But some people love it and do it, and they're the economic sphere. What Steiner said is these three shouldn't interfere with each other, they should be autonomous. So the cultural religious sphere, that's like the Brahmins, the Druids, the priests, they should get on with their thing. The political is like the Kshatriyas, they should get on with their thing, they should have their codes of honour, truth being the key fundamental one. And then the economists are the kind of the merchants, the traders, the agriculturalists. Well, they're important too. There's not one is more important than the other, and they all interfeed. And because reincarnation exists, you all get a turn at playing different roles over many lifetimes. Anyway, that was Steiner's idea. And again, it's a threefold thing. It seems to me the European Union, in its own way, is kind of sensitive to this. I'm working on a reform proposal for the European Union, so I think we need to build up more the cultural and religious sphere within it. They're a bit frightened of religion, but if the intellectual side of European cultural identity can be more affirmed, including the religious contributions Europe has we luxuriate in the profundity of religious and philosophical ideas over the centuries, and Europe shouldn't be ashamed of that, including Britain and Ireland, all the great savants of the British Isles who I've studied under and sat at the feet of, I mean, metaphorically speaking. That's that sphere. The political sphere, that's fine, except they must tell the truth. And the economic sphere, well, that's good. That's what the European Union is quite good at. It's trade and let it all flourish. That's why it's so stupid to do Brexit. Okay, now then we come to another threefolding idea, which is in Judaism. And I mentioned the Qabalah a few times so far. So some of you probably know, I'm sure, that in the Qabalah there's this thing, the Tree of Life diagram. And the top of it is called Keter, the crown. I'm only going to draw the first three Sephiroth, as they're called. The crown is the absolute radiant energy of the divine. It's the King Solomon on his throne wearing a crown. It's the sense of